And good afternoon, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here, live at YouTube and subscribing platforms. Doovid is here, a fellow YouTube host. We're doing this thing of ours every Thursday at around 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're doing it a little early today because I have Jordan Rich coming on at 2 o'clock. I'm really looking forward to that. He's a legendary Boston radio talk show host, and he just wrote a book about radio talk, which is absolutely important and fascinating, especially for someone like me who has been fascinated by talk radio going all the way back to the 1980s. So I'm kind of looking forward to talking to him. I'm a little intimidated. I'm a little awestruck. It's like, someone, an aspiring kid who wants to be a ball player talking to Carl Yastrzemski. I mean, it's, it's one of these things. But David, we usually talk about Jewish issues, Israel issues. You started by just commenting on where you think we are as a nation and as a world with regard to the COVID-19 pandemic. You talked about hearing my discussion with Michael Shaw, who I have on every Wednesday at 2 p.m., and who's a science writer. He's a health columnist. What are your thoughts with regard to the virus now? What do you see happening, and what do you see coming up?
Well, unfortunately, I see it getting worse. I told the Starbucks story on Week in Review with on Church of Entropy Jennifer Scharf. How I think it was last week, and I went to Starbucks. I ordered with the app beforehand, and it was a little bit crowded, but there was a line, and I'm generally a rule follower. Like intellectually, I'm like might do some things that are pretty controversial, but generally I'm a rule follower. So I stood on the dot, like you're supposed to, and just waited. Although only like two of the 15 people in there, were standing on the dot, and I had suspected that my drink was ready on the counter. I'm not sure if you go to Starbucks
Oh yeah,
recently,
absolutely.
and but generally I just wait on the dot, and I see they'll call, like he'll give attention. They know my name. I go there regularly. Tell it's ready. But be a rule follower. I'm not going to just butt in and bust up to the counter. If I'll wait my turn. Um, but it was a situation where basically following the rules was a really bad idea, and so what happened, more and more people started coming in, and it reached over capacity. Here in Michigan, they could be worried about being shut down. I don't know the exact rules, but they're over capacity, and that could be ticketable offense. So one of the baristas, who friendly with them,
Hmm.
is somewhat he comes out, and he yells at like, you got to stand on the dots. We're over capacity. If there's no dots, you have to stand outside because Governor Whitmer, there's no indoor dining right now.
Hmm.
And of like the 15 people in there, maybe like three people listened and moved over to dots, and the rest of the people just completely ignored the guy. And so meantime, I'm still standing on the same dot, and I have a feeling that my drink is ready on the counter. Um, but so the guy just like, oh man, no one listened. Who knows what he's thinking? And he just goes back behind the counter, trying to do their best. And more people are keep on coming in, and the people who come in are basically just going straight up to the counter, hovering at the counter, telling me, where's my drink? And sometimes their drink is ready, or they just have to wait. And like, I assume you've seen such things waiting in line. But so
Sure.
basically, after about 10 minutes, all the people who had rushed the counter, either get their drinks, or had backed up enough that the guy who had stepped up to tell everybody to social distance, was like, oh, David. And I was right. My drink was sitting there on the counter the whole time.
Hmm.
So for 10 minutes, um, I waited for nothing because my drink was there the whole time. Like, they're, God forbid, they're come stupid COVID-19 regulations that, like,
Hmm.
I can't just take my drink. It has to be there in interaction.
Right.
And then um, I've been reading Edward Dutton's books on intelligence, and some things on expertise. And I honestly don't think that most Americans are even capable of social distancing, even if they had to save their life. And within the conspiracy, um, I also kind of agree. I think COVID-19, it was probably man-made, although that may
Hmm.
not matter because generally I don't believe in evolution. I said a meme that evolution is a conspiracy to hide the fact that coronavirus is man-made. but that's not my expertise, not what I'm talking about.
Right.
But just the generic spread that we're not capable of social distancing. Even like my father, doctor, mother,
Hmm.
attorney, liberal, generally rule following people can't really social distance that well because it's just not in their training. It's a certain
Right. It's not
um,
American.
it's a spatial understanding. We talk about Chinese people. I was looking at the studies of
They're more conditioned to it. I mean, in a sense, because
well,
they've
they have
had.
higher IQs. Like every
Well, I think
study,
it's because they've had viruses before. That this is not new to them. This
well,
is something that's never happened in this country, at least not since World War One. I mean, no one remembers what it was like to do this, and so it's a
well,
very new thing.
we have some of the best epidemiology in America. We had the West Nile. Like I'm a civil engineer. I'm familiar with like just like you have fire evacuation plans for big enough facilities. You have to have viral epidemic safety plans, schools and stuff. So it's
Right.
not like we're completely unfamiliar. But I always make the point that Chinese people are factually higher IQ than Europeans and Americans. Like all the testing shows that Chinese people. I mean, there's different testing, but the testing generally shows that in China, the average IQ is around 105. And I'm not talking about the smart ones that become here in doctors. They're talking about poor farmers, that you take an average poor peasant farmer in China, and he has a higher IQ than your average European or American. And these testing have been known for decades. And it's also um, spatial, certain amount of spatial intelligence that the spatial intelligence testing on China show that Chinese people, and I know this as a chess player, because there are a lot of Chinese people that just destroy me at chess, a certain spatial reasoning, but it could be for like Howard Gardner. I'm sure you're familiar with 7 types of intelligence, and he had a
Hmm.
kinesthetic um, version, one of the 7 intelligence, but some spatial awareness that it's difficult for Jews. I knew I was a gabbai to rabbis in various performance concert type things that people are not spatially aware. It's not natural for people to move and reposition themselves in relation to other people. If you study martial arts or military intelligence or something like that, maybe. And thank God I did study martial arts. So I've had a little bit and did a lot of like yoga and like the phenomena.
Right.
You have to
As have I.
recognize
Yep.
recognize the position of other people and adapt. So for me, it's pretty simple. You could just have a basic feeling of how far people are away from your part,
Hmm.
away from you, and readjust your position. And I think Chinese and Japanese people um, genetically have been proven to be better at this. And in America, it is saying like even in Michigan right now, we're at the worst point ever. This was last week. Now it's a little bit better. It was the worst ever. Nearing 200 deaths a day. We had almost 10,000 new infections, and people just can't figure out how to social distance. Everybody is still just hoarding the counter at Starbucks. And my perspective is that we can't change it. And even like outdoor minion, like I would say, the modern Orthodox people near me that I pray with probably demonstrate the best impulse control of Jews generally. I mean, you can have good impulse control among Jews, but I would say modern Orthodox Jews that try to be Orthodox Jews and highly educated and successful generally have the highest impulse control among Jews. And even modern Orthodox people have a pretty difficult time social distancing. It's just like we don't need to be within 6, 8 feet. We could talk, because like we're Jews. We probably like if we were in public, one of us would, just like come up and like whisper
Hmm.
ears and like that's a
Right. No,
pretty
I get it.
Jewish social thing. But to say it's social distancing now, don't come up, don't keep the distance, and it's near impossible for Jews. You've seen Israel. Israel is now re-entering another 2-week lockdown. This is the third time that fourth time or something. That Israel's having an extended lockdown,
Hmm.
and so Israel is probably a model for what's going to happen in the West. And the coronavirus normally hits in November, December, January. This is the flu season, and we're indoors, and not barring any mutations or serious effects that could also happen that make it worse. Even if the vaccine works, my estimation is that the worst is ahead of us. Even if you want to,
Okay.
Joe Biden in his speech said that our darkest hours are ahead of us, and to me that seems perfectly logical without any conspiracy. We're indoors, it's cold, and people have not learned how to social distancing. All the election, the news media, like even my mother was probably doing. She's having a more difficult time now because the media and the leftists aren't giving her the um I guess um the signal, for some reason the virtue signal that the leftists had in the beginning to obey the rules, where now there's really no longer any virtue signal from the left. So people are just basically all for themselves, and at the end of the day, people are not capable of social distancing, and the virus is going to spread. And how deadly or whatever it's going to be, whether it's going to cause a million more deaths before, assuming the vaccine works. Even the
Well, look,
conservative
I
estimates
want
from
to
people who,
interject on that, David. The first of all, you bring up a lot of very interesting questions about genetics versus culture versus, perception, and those are big debates. I tend to lean on the side of culture. I don't think genetics have much to do with it. Genetics might instruct certain abilities and certain skills, but the more important element there is how an individual and how a culture utilizes those skills. I mean, you can have super intelligence and become like a Nazi. I mean, it's not, intelligence itself is not, I think, something that should be viewed as a virtue or should certainly be viewed as something that would dictate someone's behavior. I think behavior is dictated by culture, it's dictated by decision. Now, I just want to, I really feel the need before we go further on that to comment on your assertion that you think there's going to be millions of deaths. Now, you listened yesterday to my interview with Michael Shaw, who I have on every afternoon on Wednesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and who's like a kind of a health expert. He's written thousands of columns over many years. And he pointed out that the reason why we have increased numbers in this country and possibly elsewhere is because of the nature of how we do the testing, which he says, and this has been acknowledged by the New York Times. They did a big article about this last summer, that they calibrated the testing in such a way that it magnifies the detection of COVID-19 in a person 3 times what would one would expect on average, which means that if you have the tiniest drop of COVID-19 in your system, something that's more than asymptomatic, is something that you'd never know, because we all carry viruses in our systems. Everyone does. Then that shows up as COVID-19, and it goes into the stats as COVID-19. So the numbers are inflated, according to Mike, and also hospitals. When someone dies in a hospital, if they even have a drop of COVID-19 in their system, the hospital has a financial incentive to report that as a COVID-19 death, when in fact they may have, and more likely had, died of more conventional issues like cancer or heart disease or something else, diabetes. And so I think that the numbers are inflated generally, and the numbers of deaths are inflated generally. And with this new surge, which I think pretty much got off the ground in starting in last September, there has not been an increase in the numbers of deaths. There may be an increase on the record, on the books, of the numbers of people who have the contagion, but the death rate has not increased. And the Centers for Disease Control published an article which was on the website. I don't know why this wasn't more reported in the media. It should have been. I have my suspicions in terms of why it wasn't. But this article showed that the death rate for COVID-19 is less than 1%. It's actually like a 0.5% until you reach the age of 80, in which case it goes up to maybe 2 or 3%. So the bottom line is that this is a terrible disease and people should protect themselves, but it is not this scourge that we are led to believe it is. It's not leading to mass deaths. As I just illustrated, at least that's my understanding. So I think
I check
that,
the numbers every day and say, like, as far as I know, we're at the highest daily death count in America. It's been
right,
like
but as
over
I said, the
2,000
way,
deaths a day for two
Doovid, you
weeks
have
now.
to look.
We're approaching 3,000.
I get
The
it, but
caseload is the highest ever.
look at how they
So,
report this.
I
As
mean,
I
any
just
any
said, I don't want to
basic way
go.
of looking,
Look, I don't want to go on a
I accept all
merry-go-round
your
with you.
arguments as true,
Thank
and
you.
say that you're saying yes, the percentage has decreased, and a lot of the evidence shows that originally when the April uh, surge came, the death rate was about 2%, and now it's down to 0.5%. So if only 1 out of 4
Right.
of the people, like 25% people, uh, are only dying now from the beginning because better medical treatment or knowledge or various things. But
And
the
that some of the
caseload
people
is so much
reported
higher
were
now.
not didn't actually die of
But the number
COVID
of infections now is so much higher. So even if only one
because
out
of the
of
way
four of the
it's
people were
tested.
dying,
As I said, it was because
well,
of the way it was.
even if that's true, is saying like, are you rejecting the huge death load that, like, I mean, just the papers that every day 2,000 3,000
What I'm
people dead,
suggesting
even if
is,
it's only 1,000,
thank you
even if it's
for
only
asking.
five.
What I'm suggesting is, as I said, the cause of death is apparently, and this has been reported by a lot of people, a lot of whistleblowers at hospitals, that it's not really necessarily because of COVID. It's because of regular things that people die from, like cancer
Well, I agree with
and
that. And
heart
saying if you're
disease.
talking
But if they
about,
have
are
even a
you talking about people
smidgen,
that didn't have COVID at all
no, I'm saying
and
that
were
they
died?
might.
You're talking about people that had
Thank you for
comorbidities or other
asking.
things. You're
I'm
talking about people
saying
that
that
those
people,
people were infected by
no,
COVID
I'm
and you're
saying
admitting
that
it.
somebody who even has a tiny drop of COVID in their system, which is normal because we all carry viruses, if it is detected by these high caliber detection testing machines, then the death certificate, they put on the death certificate COVID when that wasn't the cause of death. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying run outside now and, start to congregate. Nobody, I don't think we should. I don't. We have to be careful because it's a terrible disease. But I'm saying that the way this thing is positioned, I think, has increased not just some of necessarily the hysteria around it, but has given birth to some of these policies, which may not necessarily, you know, be in the best interest.
See,
Now,
I'm not supporting lockdowns or the policies
right.
of the people saying it, but I'm just saying that from my understanding, even if I grant you everything that you're true, you're still agreeing a lot of people are dying from this,
Yeah, a lot
and
of people are dying of the
and
flu
the people
too.
that are going to die from it is probably going to be more
No, I don't think that's
than it was
necessarily
over the
true.
next few months.
No, I don't know if that's
That you
true.
just and I also think that the whole bending the curve thing. I mean, like, my mother read, the New York Times. She still does every day of her life, and she's retired and she lost some of her competitive edge, I believe, in terms of law from not recognizing that the New York Times wasn't enough to keep alone to keep her news competitive edge. But like, I read the
Mm-hmm.
New York Times most days, and from what I see, almost we're approaching capacity, the failure to bend the curve, in that over 30% of hospitals across the US are at capacity, and over 60% of hospitals are within 15% of capacity. And what happens when hospitals um, hit over capacity is going to be that the death rate is going to increase, and the spread is going
Okay.
to increase.
All
So
right.
saying
Fair
that,
enough.
like, do
If
you agree that the hospitals,
it may be, I
and
mean,
saying
that may
like, if
happen. I
I'm
don't think
telling you,
so.
okay, I watch Vincent Raccanello, Columbia University, I watch JAMA, Journal of Medicine, I watch University of California, Berkeley, I'm watching mainstream sources, Harvard, MedCram, and they all seem to agree on this consensus: the worst is ahead of us, and the warning that we don't know what's going to happen if the hospitals hit over capacity, and also the
Right.
current case number. If you look at it, like, Israel in Christmas, God forbid, might be a disaster in terms of that. With the current caseload, Michigan right now is on a decline. We're down to like 3,000 cases a day, but still hovering at like 100 deaths a day from the Thanksgiving surge. But if Christmas hits and we're back over to 10,000 cases a day, and then the hospitals are overloaded, that will spell a disaster that they were warning. That's the whole reason why
Right.
we shut down in the first place, was to bend the curve so that the
The
hospitals,
hospitals don't get
that was the, I
overwhelmed.
mean, you agree
No, I
that
get that.
that was the main justification for the
It
shutdown,
was,
was we
although that never happened. And
was saying now it's going to happen. Now,
I give
even
you the
with the
example.
shutdown, it
Well,
appears
we'll
that
see.
we didn't bend the curve enough, and the hospitals are going to be over
We'll
capacity.
see. And
And
also, I think
every
it's
expert in the world has been warning us
all
of
right.
dire
Fine.
catastrophe, millions of deaths. And saying, I mean, you're in
We shall
Boston, and
see.
saying like,
Boston is
I
an
don't think there's
epicenter.
anyone at Harvard that's not saying what I'm saying.
Fine, and that very well may be. There very well may be an increase. And yes, I think that's something else that Michael Shaw said on my show, is that the main cause of the spread are people inside gathering in houses. It's not going out to restaurants or supermarkets or being outside. And I
It's your own
think that,
family. It was Dr. Fauci. It said it's you and your family getting together
yeah,
for
I know, I
Thanksgiving.
agree with that. And I
And
think that,
it's
but I think we should,
it's Dr.
we,
Bricks that couldn't resist getting together with her own family over
right,
the
all
holidays,
right.
even though she told all Americans not to.
Yeah, that's why she's gone.
And
But I
then it's
think,
the, saying if it was Chinese people, genetically or culturally, maybe it'd be possible that they could do these things and not spread it, because culturally, social distancing.
no, I think it's
But
important to note
from,
here,
I don't
Dovid.
think that we're culturally or even genetically capable of social distancing. I think it's literally
Yeah, I
impossible
think
for
that
us.
it's important to note that we need to continue to put this thing in perspective and take proper precautions
I
because
mean, would you admit that yourself, that if you had not studied martial arts, that social distancing might be beyond you?
not really. I've never liked to get close to people anyway. I
I'm
never
just in awareness. Even okay, you didn't
personally.
like to
I
be
don't
close,
have any
but to have a
problem.
spatial awareness
No, I
to,
mean, I personally don't like crowds. I personally don't need to shake people's hands. I don't like physical contact. I actually think that those are traditions that probably should go by the wayside. Asian countries, they don't make physical contact as part of their culture. They bow slightly in each other's presence and they acknowledge each other without physical. In America, we tend to like to touch each other at handshakes and back slaps. I've never been one who's comfortable with that. I've always liked to keep my space. Um, I think that,
I did food service.
can I say something here, David? I think
Yeah,
that we should also put this in perspective in that I know people in my life, you probably do too, who are so super paranoid about this that they won't touch like a doorknob, or they won't touch a mailbox outside, or they're wearing the mask outside or even in their cars when there's no one around. And to me, that's, it's actually wearing the mask is actually can be detrimental because you're inhaling your own carbon monoxide. And, I'm not saying don't wear one. I do when I'm in certain situations, but you should really do so sparingly and do so when needed, not just put it on for the day. And I know that people who are first responders, they have to, and I really admire them. I admire them for that, and I respect what they're doing. But I think that for the average person, there's a major overreaction out there, and we should all stay careful. But let's not, get go, become so paranoid that we're not even able to function at all. We need to continue to operate and use good judgment at a time when there's this spreading virus.
yes. I mean, I think that's beyond us. And yeah, I was kind of always a cleanliness, even Nazi.
Right,
To
me too.
I always used my shirt sleeve to touch door handles if I
Right,
didn't have to. Like I always,
me
like
too. I mean,
embarrassedly, like
so to
wash my
me, there's
hands
no big
after
deal.
shaking hands. I don't want to, like do it right so the
Exactly.
person would notice. But it's like like, oh man, I got to wash my
No,
hands now.
I tend to be that way
And I
too. It's
used to
just
do food
normal
distribution.
to
I
me.
took the risk, like at the Hindu temples, and I used to, I used to have to yell at people to wash their hands and put on gloves, and like, you used to tell them kids aren't cute. Like kids have germs, kids sneeze in the pot, and
Right.
everyone eats it. Like it's not cute to have a little kid right up next to the food. And so I was always that personality. And when President Trump originally, I had agreed like this is in many ways going to be good for us, because a lot of these things, like people sneezing all over you and
Right.
spreading germs, that was the commonplace. And I was the jerk who was willing to be a jerk, because I like cleanliness and was scared about germs. So like for years, I had been a jerk like that, and now, but I don't think these things are being normalized. So like Trump originally, now it's all like vaccine, get back to normal, as opposed to Trump is like, yeah, like these changes, not shaking hands, and germ knowledge are going to be permanent. And no one seems to be saying that in the mainstream anymore. It's like, oh, vaccine, get back to normal. And just look what's happening in Israel. Israel is re-entering lockdown, and Israel basically seems to be under the understanding Israelis are not capable of social distancing. So the only way to do
Right.
it is to let the cases increase, and once they get past the brink, they got to lock down. And because just Israelis and like Americans, it's a certain level impulse control, culture, normalcy. Israelis maybe even worse than Americans. Of
Hmm.
social distancing is like a sentence to prison. If you're Chinese, like I talked to
You know
Edward
what's
Dutton
interesting, Doovid?
about
Why is
Finnish
it?
people. Said like Finnish people,
Yeah.
what we consider social distancing right now is actually the norm. Like, but I haven't
Well,
hugged my
let me.
mother
I
since
want to ask you.
March. And if your studies, like your average Finnish person only hugs their mother once a year, anyways, or
Right,
whatever
right.
that basis. But in
But
Israeli or
what
American
about
culture,
Africa? What about Africa? Like, for example, and this will lead me into another thought. Africa was expected to have a huge, devastating exposure to COVID-19 at the beginning of the epidemic, but that never happened. It's very rare in Africa, and Africa is generally poorer than other continents, and people live in very close quarters. And yet, there was no major COVID outbreak in Africa. And some of the speculation on that is that it's because Africa is a younger continent. You don't have too many Africans that are over the age of 80 or even over the age of 75, around that age.
even
And that,
comorbidities, that Africa in general has less
right. And also
comorbidities.
that Africans have their own viruses. It's not like it's manifesting. But the
In
point
sun,
here,
the virus doesn't do as good in
but the
sun,
point that I
in
want to make
indoor
here, yeah,
transmission.
and
There's a whole bunch of reasons.
the point I want to make here, David, is that elderly people, particularly people in nursing homes, are the most vulnerable segment in our population, and they have also been the highest mortality in our population, which brings me to the issue of how it is that in certain states, in particularly New York, but also your own state, Governor Whitmer, and in California, you had governors basically contradict federal policy early on in the pandemic, like in April, and put COVID-19 active people from hospitals into nursing homes where they infected people and with how many thousands, if not tens of thousands of people would die. Now, to me, this is almost a genocidal policy. I don't know. They have never explained it. It
It's just
has never.
stupidity and incompetence. Even
No,
in,
it's
in
not
Michigan,
stupidity.
all the
You and
best
I are not so
experts.
stupid. You and I would know you don't put a COVID-19 active person in a nursing home. That's not stupidity. Any schmo on the street knows that you don't do that. This was a deliberate policy, and they have never explained, at least not adequately, why they were doing this. And it's interesting in
Well, they did
Pennsylvania.
explain. Michigan, they explained because they wanted guaranteed placement in whatever reason of the situation with nursing homes. They were able to guarantee. They needed to make sure. I mean, this was the Michigan claim. They needed to make sure that discharged COVID patients had a guaranteed place to
So
place
they put
them.
them in nursing homes? That's
That was, and
hogwash.
according to the governor's best defense, that was the only thing they could
That's bull
find or
crap.
do to
That
guarantee
is a
that they.
load of crap.
It
There were
probably
plenty of places they
is.
could have put people.
I mean, to
Here
say
in
it's nefarious or
Massachusetts,
incompetence, I
no,
don't
it's
know.
not incompetence. Here in Massachusetts, they have
I think it is incompetence.
no. If
Personally,
they have housing in
there might be some
Massachusetts,
nefarious level,
no, there's I
but
don't.
it
I'm
leads
not
to
saying I know what it
incompetent people
is.
being in decision
No, it's
making.
not incompetent. The governor of Michigan's not incompetent. She's
She is
very witty.
incompetent. I'm saying when it comes to these medical things,
And
she
why is
probably
it
is
that these
incompetent.
other blue state governors did this in Michigan? I'll give you an example. In Pennsylvania, the chief of health, she removed her 95-year-old mother from a nursing home in advance. No, and this shows she knew damn well that this was going to be a disaster. I mean, to me, any school kid would know you just don't put somebody who's actively has this virus into a nursing home. That's insane, and I think it has genocidal overtones. There has never been. I mean, in Massachusetts, they didn't do this with one exception, the Holyoke Retirement Home for Veterans, which is responsible for a lot of the deaths in our state. But
Yeah, I read about that.
yeah, but Massachusetts has these housing areas for people who are homeless or people who are indigent, where they house them. And that's where they send people who have the COVID-19 virus. And that's where you have people who are experts and who are state employees who know how to handle them and keep them isolated. They didn't put them in nursing homes. This happened in New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and California, maybe some other states. But I think that there needs to be some kind of a reckoning for this, because this accounts for a very significant percentage. I think actually more than half of the numbers of deaths that have been recorded on COVID. And those are real COVID deaths. That's not, cooking the books to get more money. I mean, those are people who are vulnerable, and a moral society protects the most vulnerable. So
Yeah,
that's what I have to say on that.
I was making the joke on Sunday, although, God forbid I'm actually serious, is that the U.S. has already fallen and they just postponing telling us. And to some extent, like the stimulus package and the debt, I think we're going to run a
Oh, well, that hasn't
3.1
been,
trillion.
being vetoed by President Trump. It's a disaster.
But I mean, because he wants to spend more money. And
no, that's untrue. That's fake news. What he wants to do is he wants to take out the $250 million for the Palestinian Authority. He wants to take out the $10 million for gender research in Pakistan. He wants to take out all these things that have nothing to do with COVID and who have everything to do with liberal causes. He wants to take out the $40 million that's going to the Kennedy Center when they're not even having any concerts.
Yeah, I read about that, but it's like generally, I'm not judging President Trump favorably on this. I mean, you might be able to.
Well, that's why he's vetoing
I think
it.
President Trump is just as willing to bankrupt America
I reject that.
as anybody else.
No, I reject
as
that.
the Democrats, and generally, this package just shows that
this package
everybody
shows that
just
he's
like
exposed.
as long as you get to bankrupt America and give it to who we want to give to.
How come he got up and he gave a speech, which by the way was censored by and blacked out by the mainstream media, where he exposed all of this corruption and this graft and this fraud that had been salted into that bill? Now, years ago, I interviewed Jack Abramoff.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the first time he did it in 4 years.
That's not
like
true.
it took him till he's almost out of the White House to do that. Like President Trump
untrue.
ran huge deficits unrepentantly.
He's been refusing to sign this COVID bill from day one, which has nothing to do with
not because he's opposed
COVID.
to huge deficits unrepentantly.
No, it is because
I don't think that's the reason.
No, I mean, look,
I think it's a political move. It might be a good strategy, but you say President Trump has ran huge deficits, record deficits.
Look,
and
this is the one area where I probably agree with you. He has been a bigger spender than we had hoped. But I think that given, but by relative standards, he's been much more conservative than any Democrat that would have been in office. And certainly he needs a line item veto, which of course, has not been approved, so that he could go through.
Where are we going to get this money from? I'm saying, I don't buy it.
Well, he could go through these bills line by line and veto this crap
let's put my
so that the real
vision.
money can go in.
Trump, I never bought his, call it a lie, like his narrative, like the economy was doing the best ever, and then this virus never should have happened.
It was doing the best ever.
I didn't buy that narrative, but whatever the point,
statistically, it was.
Is that
I mean, it's not a narrative.
We were running
either we were or we weren't.
And
the deficit, but the economy itself and people's employment and people's function and people's ability to get opportunity, particularly minorities, statistically and graphically has increased. That's not a matter of opinion. That's something that is, you could look at the Office of Management and Budget, which is run by the U.S. Congress and is not a political body, and look at their statistics. You could look at the Department of Labor and their statistics.
Yeah, I'm not an economist. I'm not going to argue the point, but no, I don't buy it. I don't buy the Trump.
Buy whatever you want. Look, you can argue opinion. You can't argue facts.
Argue that the stock market price, there are certain indicators that Trump mentions again and again, but there's other indicators.
No, the employment.
That he's ignoring.
Like the
employment. Deficit, the debt.
I agree with you on the deficit. It should not be as high. But employment, particularly for minorities, has reached unprecedented levels before the pandemic, and opportunities, businesses expanding, businesses opening new business because of a reduction in onerous regulation
Let me
and a
just say,
holding of the line on taxes allowed for more investment domestically.
and it's
Those
not my
things are
expertise.
not
So I don't want to
opinion.
argue
Those
with
are
on
all right. Thank you.
but you know, the view that Trump is bankrupting our country, and you know, to the
Maybe, but
extent
less
that
so.
we are bankrupt, it's over. The country is
Oh, that's
officially
a very
bankrupt. We're never
pessimistic.
getting out of this bankruptcy. And where are we going to get this money from, Charles? Where are we going to get the money to repay the $3.1 trillion deficit that was
We're
ran
going to
this year?
increase. We're
Where are
going to
we going to
increase.
get the money
Thank you for
to pay
asking.
for the $1 trillion that we're borrowing? Because Biden and Trump are so sure that once we beat this virus, we're going to be back to better than ever. And I
Well,
say,
Trump is.
absolutely not. What makes them think that America is going to be better than ever once we beat this virus? And
I
we're
think it will be.
eventually,
At least in Trump's
China,
in
whoever
Trump's
is
second
lending us
term.
this money, is going to call us on our debt. And I think at this point, with the
No, they
virus
will
in
not
the
call us
spending
on the debt.
package,
Not
I
if
would
we
even
borrow
say,
more
like,
money from them.
the union is basically done. Like, we're never going to be able to repay back this deficit. And whatever idiot is
That's
dumb
very
enough to
pessimistic
let us,
view.
whatever idiot is dumb enough to let us borrow the money to put out this spending
Well,
package,
Trump just
we're not
vetoed
going
it.
to be able to repay it.
Trump just vetoed it, so it's not. We're talking about
He
a
didn't
theoretical.
veto it for the right reason. And saying
Whatever
Trump
reason,
doesn't mind bankrupting
I
the
think he
country.
did.
Trump,
But what we can, whether he did or not, the point is he's going to, and that's a fact. And look, I think that you have to.
I predict that the spending bill includes more. That the one eventually Trump signs will have double the
Well, you
spending of
can
the one that
predict
he
all you want.
vetoed.
I hope you're wrong. I think I think that Trump has just launched his second term by exposing the bill and by vetoing it, which is a very courageous thing to do because the media, of course, is going to say, and they're already lying and saying, oh, he's hurting people who have COVID. The bill only gave people affected by COVID $600, whereas all these other special interests were getting tens of millions of dollars who have nothing to do with COVID. So Trump is taking a very courageous stand in that regard. I think this
By
is the
borrowing
first
money from China to give to us when
by
China's
saying
the
we're
one who
not going to
caused the
borrow
virus
the
here.
money. Look, Doovid, I just
Where's this
pointed
money
out
coming from?
it's
You're not
not
claiming
coming
that
from
this
anywhere because
deficits are
he's
coming from money
vetoing the
borrowed from
bill.
China. But
Doovid,
he's
he is
eventually going to sign the bill,
vetoing.
and the deficit he's
You
going
think
to
he
accept.
is? We
Trump
shall
is
see.
going to borrow this money from
We
China.
shall
Are you saying?
see.
Are you claiming that
Well,
Trump has a plan other than borrowing this money
we
from
shall
China?
see what he
Did you
borrows.
see
And
about the shekel? I mean, I didn't send you the paper, but Israel, the shekel is now 3 shekels to the dollar, and the Israeli Reserve Bank is buying up dollars to prevent its free fall. This is in
okay,
Israel. I don't know if you saw this news, but the
that's
dollar
interesting.
is in free fall in Israel, so much so that the Federal Reserve
Well,
of
then
Israel
it's all the
is
more
propping
reason.
up the dollar. And
Fine,
I'm
it's all
saying,
the more reason why the
are you
media has to
claiming on
reject this
any
bill.
circumstance, whatever President veto, whatever your opinion, that Trump has any other intention of the bill that he signs that this money will be
We'll
borrowed
see if
from
he
China?
signs it.
But when he
Well,
does,
you're right. He
if the
probably
bill that
will be.
he's willing to sign, does he intend? Where does he
Yeah,
intend on? He
probably.
intends on borrowing the money from China, right?
Probably, but the point is, it'll be a pared down bill that only deals with the emergency, not this
But I'm talking
trillion
about the
dollars.
essential problem. Is you agree that President Trump plans on borrowing this money from China?
Yes, I think but I think it'll be a minimal
How the hell is
amount.
that going to help the
I'll
U.S.
tell. Thank
to
you for
borrow money
asking.
from China in this
Because
situation?
because if we once we get through the virus and people who are in trouble get enough to paper over the problems until we get to the other side, then you have a resurgence of the economy and you have a paying of it back.
And
You
then we're
have
going to
to
be able to
borrow
repay China our debt?
if it's done moderately,
No, I
not if
say it's
it's not
almost
if it's done
guaranteed
with
we're
a
going to
trillion
default.
dollars.
At this point, I'm saying we're going to default on our debt
No,
to
we're not.
China. And what's going to happen when we default on our
China
debt
needs
to
us still
China?
more than we need them. China would implode itself if they tried to recall debt. They don't have the kind of economy that can sustain that. Even if they are involved in a conspiracy to hurt us, it won't work because we're not going to go that far in and do this $1 trillion deal. By the way, most of the money that we're borrowing will probably end up in China anyway, because these countries are going to use it to buy arms. It'll end up in China and Russia. So that's why Trump, and he said this in his speech, that's why he's not signing this bill. So you and I can argue about the bill.
I
The
mean, he
fact
finally
is,
grew a pair once he was about to be bounced.
no, he's not
It
about to
took
be
him four
bounced.
years
He's
to
gonna
grow a pair, and if only when he was about to be
not
bounced, he grew a
true. He
pair.
hasn't. Not true. He's not. First of all, he's not going to be bounced, and secondly, he has not signed this kind of COVID bills from day one. And the Democrats keep putting one up there, and he's not signed these things. Yeah, I think he did once early in the term, and I criticize that. I think that was a mistake for him to do. But for the most part, given given the opposition, he's been pretty conservative in this regard, and that if you borrow a moderate amount to get through the crisis, when the economy comes back, you have an increase in employment, which means an increase in taxes, and the taxes go to pay back the deficit. That's how it's always worked. Look, Dwight Eisenhower in 1958, in response to a short downswing, borrowed money, and it was pretty much paid back a year and a half later because it was only borrowed for very specifically targeted situations that needed to be helped. And once the situation went back to status quo ante, the deficit was paid back. So I'm not against deficits. I'm not against borrowing and deficit spending, but President Trump understands, and that speech he just delivered and other speeches throughout his presidency indicate that he knows that you have to borrow very carefully, and you don't use the opportunity as a political football to pay off your friends, like people at the Kennedy Center and other people who have nothing to do with COVID. Let them get money from George Soros. What the hell do they need taxpayer money for? Anyway, but Doovid, let's talk about something else.
But okay, I'll make my
We
last
can have the
point
last word.
is unfortunately, I think COVID's going to continue, but I think it's the debt and the deficit to China that's going to put the final nail
Okay,
in
which is
America.
why we should
And
limit
I
it.
think that Trump, the Democrats and Republicans, is that all of them are going to willfully bankrupt and screw our country beyond repair. And it's not going to be a partisan thing. There's no better Republican or Democrat. They're all going to agree that we should just borrow as much money as possible and give it away. And it's going to be the final nail in the coffin of America, God forbid. And, COVID-19.
Okay, well, I hope you're wrong, Doovid. You may be right. I don't think so. At least as of today, President Trump has gone on record as saying he is not going to sign the bill. So we'll see. Anyway, what else? What's going on? We're going to talk a little bit about Israel politics and what's happening.
So, I mean,
there.
Israel re-entering lockdown, vaccine. I saw more like Indonesia, even the terms of, bankrupting America for these Israeli peace deals where, I mean, there might be some greater reasoning, but, now Trump is offering $2 billion or Pompeo, to Indonesia to normalize ties.
Mhm.
And it might continue. And it could be, like, God forbid, Adam Green is right. Jared Kushner does not give a crap. He will bankrupt America. He figures America's going down anyways.
Oh,
And he's
that's
going to use the
ridiculous.
last power to wield whatever power America has to,
Well, if he
to
bankrupts
help,
America,
help
well, how does that
Israel.
help Israel? Israel will go down with it. I mean, if the big
No, I'm
ship
saying
goes down, all the other
purpose
ships.
of it is the preparation for Israel to survive after America goes down. So it's saying like America.
That is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Why would Israel want America to go down? I mean, why
They
would
don't want America to go to. Israel is saying it's inevitable America is going to go down. It's preparing
That's
itself for a
ridiculous.
post-America age. And Jared Kushner, as the president's son, is also he's on the side of Israel. He's preparing
That's
Israel for the
ridiculous. He's a
post-America.
patriotic American. I reject that.
Well, I don't know
That's
anything about him to say or not, but you're just looking at these
well,
deals.
I mean, to make
It,
those.
it doesn't make sense to me that uh, these deals are not between Israel and those nations. These deals are between America and those nations and basically have nothing to
And
do with
Israel.
Israel.
Yes, it does. They normalize relations. That has
But they're
everything to do
not
with Israel.
normalizing it due to
Doesn't
the
matter
two
why.
countries.
They're
They're
doing it,
normalizing
and
it to
that's
a
good.
third party and what the third party is
Fine.
doing.
The United States is operating as a diplomatic go-between, making deals. I think that's great. I think that's something that has never been done before. It's not been done. I mean, this goes back to since Harry Truman was the last president to help with such deals. No, it's that's diplomacy. Why not? Why shouldn't the United States help Israel to normalize relations and at the same time improve our position with these nations by helping them? I mean, that's diplomacy. That's ending war. That's reducing conflict. I mean, I don't see.
Well, I
You're
agree
going to
with that
weave
on
some
that end, but I
conspiracy
don't think
theory.
that's. I mean, because I don't think that's what's going to
You're
happen
going
with
to
any of
weave
those
some
deals.
nutty conspiracy theory in there from Adam Green about Zionists. Israel is operating in its interest. The United States is operating in its. And I just don't think that, I think this is all a very positive development. Israel, for example, the United States worked out a deal with Morocco so that they would recognize Israel. I think they already had recognized Israel, but they normalized relations. And at the same time, the United States recognized Morocco's control over what had been formerly Spanish Sahara, which is a big strip of desert just south of Morocco on the Atlantic coast, and where there had been both radical Marxist terrorists, the Polisario movement, and also threats from the Tuareg tribes and Boko Haram. So, to my way of thinking, it's probably a good idea for Morocco to stabilize that region and recognize Morocco as the sovereign in that region. To me, these things are all positive developments. This is a win-win for all sides. I mean, it's a win for Morocco, it's a win for Israel, and it's a win for the United States.
I mean, I said last week, saying like, I don't believe Netanyahu is actually the prime minister of Israel. I think he's some sort of puppet. If a CIA puppet is the most
Let's
likely,
not go over that. These are nutty,
but
crackpot,
it's
tin
not nutty,
hat
but it's saying
conspiracy
that
theories.
Israel just called another election,
Fine.
and you know that they're not going to be able to get rid of Netanyahu. You know that no matter what, Netanyahu is going to be
they'll get
prime
rid of
minister
him
next term.
if the
It does
people
not
don't
matter
like him,
what
he'll
any
go.
Israeli tries to do. Netanyahu is still going to be just like
Because he
Morocco.
has
There's a king
popularity.
of Morocco because he's sustained by external
No,
forces,
he's
not his own
sustained by a
people,
very
just like
strong following.
Netanyahu. And that's what this is about. You're saying
That's
Netanyahu does
crazy.
not represent Israel. He's still going to
He
be prime
represents
minister.
his following,
But
which
what
is
about the
substantial.
election? How is it possible that Netanyahu somehow, after 4 elections,
Because
is
he's
still
got
going to be
following.
prime minister? No, because he's got international support.
No, it's
that
because he's got Israeli
overpowers.
following. That's not true. They do polls in Israel. Netanyahu and his free market approach and his various policies are
Yeah,
very
that's what you're saying.
popular
That's not
in
Israel. That's foreign
No, it's
American
Israelis.
intervention. Israel
It's
was set
not.
up as a socialist country, Charles.
Yeah,
You
that
are a
was in
foreign
1948.
interventionist trying to change
No.
Israel by propping up
No,
Netanyahu as a
no,
dictator in
Israel in 1948, Israel was a
a socialist
socialistic
country.
country. You're right. But in 1949, the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, he made it clear that he was going to tilt away from socialism, and he tilted toward the United States. It was very controversial at the time, but you might
see
study Israeli
Netanyahu
history.
as an American foreign actor that
Would you say Ben-Gurion was an American foreign actor? I mean, this is
possibly also, but Netanyahu,
because they tilt in the direction of America doesn't make them
saying that
puppets of America.
you're subverting Israel to change it from socialist
It
to
changed
capitalist.
the first year of its independence.
Saying that's what you're doing right now with these deals.
I think Israel should reject socialism.
You're saying you're subverting the will of Israel, using
the majority of Israelis
America
reject socialism.
to instill a leader in Israel that the Israelis don't want, in order that you could
the
push
majority
Israel
of Israelis
to become more capitalist when Israel
socialism.
wants to be more socialist.
It doesn't prove that. Israelis have, the majority of Israelis rejected socialism. They rejected it when they elected Menachem Begin. They rejected it when they rejected the Mapai party in favor of a more moderate alliance, which turned out to be the Labor Party, which is not as socialistic. Israel has gradually and organically moved away from socialism. The Histadrut, which is the state-controlled labor movement, I think it was disbanded, or it certainly doesn't have the power it once had. Israel has moved in the direction of free market freedom, not because it's in a puppet of America, but because freedom works.
Well,
Israelis are very practical people.
I mean, you know a lot. Maybe you could give a practical, because I claim that I don't think Israel has nuclear weapons. I think it's a bluff.
I have no idea. But I can't comment on that.
If
I don't know.
Israel has nuclear weapons, there's only a handful of people. It is said Naftali Bennett has claimed that despite being, like one of the 5 most powerful people in Israel, that he still has not been let in on Israelis' nuclear weapons. So if Israel has nuclear,
that's a national security question for Israel. I don't know.
But how do they transform power? So either it's a bluff, and Netanyahu has to tell the next prime minister, oh, by the way, we don't actually have nuclear weapons. It's just a bluff. You should probably keep it
Why
up.
should that matter to you and I? That's a national security
Or there's
question.
We do, Israel does actually have nuclear weapons, and there's only a handful of people who know it. And somehow, the next prime minister, Netanyahu.
Why does this matter to you, Doovid? I mean, this is a national
I think it's the most
security
important question.
Yeah, but it's
even
not
Alan
something
Dershowitz had asked about his famous story when he asked Netanyahu, and Netanyahu asked him about, was OJ guilty, and he asked if Israel really has nuclear weapons, and they both said, we can't tell.
Yeah, it's none of his business. It's a national security question for Israel. I mean,
if it is a bluff, it's a huge deal. He's saying if Israel is bluffing,
it doesn't matter. It's none about
and it's saying there's possible Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's the U.S. that has nuclear weapons, and saying the IDF doesn't actually control the nuclear weapons. It's the U.S. Well, it's the question is saying that you have just been fooled into thinking that Israel is a sovereign
I
state.
don't look.
And
No,
it's
there's
saying
nothing to do with
Netanyahu is a
sovereignty.
dictator that's being put in by foreign
Why does
forces.
what does one thing have to do with the other? Whether Israel has nuclear weapons is a national security question for the Israelis. What does that have to do with your claim that
Well, but
Netanyahu is an
it's a
American
difference.
puppet?
As I told you, like Americans' nuclear weapons are not a matter of national security. An Iranian university student in America could be revealed the secrets of the U.S. Nuclear weapons. Like that. That's it's not a secret. Like I'm sure you know the
Right, we know
storage
we
and
have nuclear
location.
weapons. There's a little thing
You might
called
not be able to get
Hiroshima.
into the you might yeah, but I'm saying you could, as an American citizen, you could just Google and you could find the locations, the places, the names of the people who work there. You might not be able to get a security clearance to list it, but it's not a secret where we keep our
Well,
nuclear
that's
weapons
terrible.
and who's in charge of
We
it.
should keep it secret.
No, I
I
mean
mean,
that's it's
that's
been that way for 40 years. And saying
well,
that's the
fine.
American policy. It's like, no, it's not
But the
secret.
Israelis are a little
Even
bit more
Doovid,
tight-lipped when it comes to cybersecurity. They know what they're doing.
it's a different question, but I'm saying if Israel's nuclear weapons, I'm putting it two possibilities. One, Israel has nuclear weapons, but they're not really Israel's, they're America's. And the secret is that when you get to Israel's nuclear weapons, it's not Israelis, it's CIA or
All
foreign
right, I get
people.
what you. I see
Or
what you're
or
getting
a
at.
point where
That
Israel doesn't actually have nuclear weapons. And what does that mean militarily in terms of these agreements? If Iran in Syria and these other countries, like it was a bluff the whole time. Israel doesn't have nukes.
well, that's all the more reason why Israel probably doesn't want to reveal this thing one way or the other, and that the fact, and if
Well,
in
as
fact
Jimmy Carter
Israel,
said, the opposite. He knows Israel. In Israel, if they had a nuke, would it test? That's what Jimmy Carter
fine,
said
and if they
multiple
don't,
times. That he knows the Israelis. The Israelis definitely, if had a nuclear weapon, would have tested to demonstrate it.
that's his opinion. I don't trust Jimmy Carter for these issues, especially with Israel. What he called Israel an apartheid state. But putting that aside, I think that if Israel doesn't have nuclear weapons, that doesn't in any way alter Israel's military position. I mean, it's because I don't think, and maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think any of the other Middle East countries have nuclear weapons either. And maybe they might be. I mean, to suggest that because, like, I don't know, Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, does that make them a proxy of the Soviet Union, which
Well,
does,
it's
or Russia?
biased. I mean, it goes back to the narrative I'm weaving that America is so far in the decline, like we might even be bankrupt. Israel knows it,
No,
and
we're not
Israel
in
know the
decline.
reason that we're doing these deals is because Israel knows that
We're doing it out
American
of strength.
military edge is on its last
That's
legs
not
and
true.
needs to reposition itself
Our
for after
military
the
edge is
fall of
becoming
America.
big,
So if
is more
Israel
powerful
doesn't
than
have
ever.
nuclear weapons and it was largely dependent on the help for America, if America appears to be on a rapid decline,
It's
Israel
not
has
on a
to
rapid
take another
decline.
approach to its security,
There's no evidence
other
of
than
that.
bluffing people out that we have nuclear weapons or the help of America.
Militarily, we're on the
So
upswing.
that's
There's
why we're
no,
making all these peace deals with Muslims
no,
and
we're
Arabs.
making them out of positions of strength. And by the way, if Trump serves his second term, we'll be in an even bigger
I'm
position of
saying position of
strength.
weakness. I mean, the weakness is
I
America. I'm
reject
saying
that. It's
Israel,
because of
but I'm saying
strength.
America's in the position of weakness. So Israel is
I
making these deals
reject
because
that.
Israel recognized that America is the main client state, supporter of
With
Israel,
the
and
help of
America is in a
America,
position of weakness, and therefore
I
Israel needs to
reject
get
that.
these deals done as quickly as possible before the Arab world
I
recognize that
reject
America
that.
is in a big place of weakness and can't
America's in
really
a
help
stronger
Israel
position
anymore.
than ever, and in the second Trump term, will be even stronger. Yeah, you talk
As he
militarily,
borrowed trillions of dollars from China.
which Trump again. Let's not go back there. He hasn't signed it. The American military capability is stronger than ever right now, and Trump has everything to do with having improved that, while at the same time disengaging and de-escalating foreign
I
wars.
mean, the emergency bill needs money to protect, to rebuild the naval or prevent the rise of China and these various things. I'm saying that the bill that President Trump, I thought it was a
Oh, you're talking about
bill.
the defense bill.
Well, I
Well,
mean, wasn't
look, I think that Trump will
isn't
eventually
Trump
sign
claiming
that.
that we need like hundreds of billions of dollars just to prevent the U.S.
No,
military
the
from
the
falling
reason why
behind other
Trump didn't
nations?
the
I mean, isn't that how they're pitching that if we
no the
don't give
reason
this
why
hundreds of billions of dollars right now, COVID-19 will have a disastrous effect
my
on
understanding
America's
of it,
international military edge?
if I could just interject here, my understanding is that the reason Trump doesn't want, we're talking about two bills here. We're talking about the COVID bill, which Trump has said he's not going to sign, and which is a fraud, and we're talking about the defense appropriation. My understanding is that the reason Trump is not signing that one, or says he's not, is because they worked in a little bit of language there that abrogates the Insurrection Act, and that That's an act that has been in place in this country, I think, for 100 years, and it means that the president of the United States cannot assume emergency powers in the case of a foreign nation
Yeah, I read that, but
interfering in
I'm
the
talking
United
about the
States.
basic that we're admitting, the Trump administration and Congress, that due to the COVID-19 situation, if we don't immediately allocate hundreds of billions of dollars, the US will have disastrous effects to our global
You mean
military
you're
edge.
talking about for the military bill?
Well, I mean, I'm not talking about why President vetoed it, but I'm talking why we need it in the first place. And the claim is that we have to spend hundreds of billions of dollars
Well,
immediately
and Trump
due
has
to
said he's not going to
lifting a
sign that.
possible edge. But he's not signing it due to a different reason. He agrees, Trump and
You
the
do need some
Republicans agree
spending.
that the American global military edge is at risk due to COVID, and that's why they want to
No,
borrow hundreds of billions of
I
dollars
think
to
that the
keep that
defense,
military edge.
my understanding is that the military spending bill is not significantly bigger than, if not, it maybe not even bigger than the average military spending bill that goes before
But
Congress
is
every
needed to
year.
keep the qualitative military edge.
Sure.
And,
I
and
mean, every
the
year they do
Republicans and
that.
presidents saying if we don't spend that money,
Fine.
that our
They're probably
qualitative
right.
global military edge could rapidly crumble
All
away.
right, then, well,
I mean,
so, I mean,
you are agreeing to that is what.
probably. I mean, that's every year they have a military spending bill, and every year they debate
If we go bankrupt in
the
one
side
year,
of
we
it.
can't renew that. That means like we can't stop China from controlling the
No,
seas and
the
all these
military,
various things.
we
Within a year or two,
well,
if we
Doovid, if
lose
we go
funding to these
bankrupt, we won't be able to do a
institutions, the
lot of
global.
things. We're not going bankrupt.
Well, I think that's part of the reason why these Israel deals is because we're going bankrupt and
We're
we know we
not
can't
going
do these things
bankrupt here,
anymore. That's why
Doovid.
we're making
That's
deals with
untrue.
Morocco
I
and all
reject
these
that.
countries because we don't have the money to
We're
leverage
doing it
power.
out of strength. We're not going bankrupt, for God's sakes. Anyway, Doovid,
Come, come on, it's like, come on, we're not doing this out of
we are
strength.
not going bankrupt. That's all. We just ain't. Anyway, Doovid, let's start wrapping it up. Um,
Any Christmas message? I
Christmas
guess the
message
famous
is Merry
Nickelback.
Christmas.
I mean
Merry
the
Christmas
I
to
mean, God
all of
forbid
our
the Kabbalists
listeners.
said that the tuma of Christmas was so much that we can't even learn Torah tonight.
Well,
And
the
it's
Jewish tradition on Christmas is to kind of play funny games and to maybe help the homeless. And there's Operation Ezra, which Jews go out and they work soup kitchens and they try to
you know anything
do
about the
do
running of
good.
the Jews in ancient Rome, the claim.
Yeah, they just make them run naked through the
But I
streets. It
mean
was
that was a
terrible.
pre that happened on Christmas and it was
Yeah,
pre-Christian
horrible,
era.
very
That
anti-Semitic.
the concept of Nittelnacher, the Jews believing that the solstice or December 25th is a bad omen for the Jews, actually predates Christianity. So we say Jews are superstitious, that Christmas is bad for us, that we had these superstitions from Roman pre-Christian times.
I think that those might have been more Roman pagan superstitions, but
But
yes,
they did have some sort of running
the
the Jew
medieval,
ceremony
yeah,
that
the
happened
medieval
on Christmas.
Vatican was humiliated Jews every year by making them run through the streets naked, and they'd whip them, and it was a tremendously anti-Semitic thing.
I mean, there's some claim that that wasn't instituted by the church, that that was a Roman custom that happened
Could
on
have
the
been,
day before Christmas or Jesus even came.
could have been. Well, before Jesus, I don't think there were too many Jews in Rome.
What are
I
you
mean, I
talking
think that
about? Cicero claims that, I mean, Cicero's later. The statistics show that when Rome had 1 million people, that over 50,000 residents
okay,
um,
I could be
were
wrong
Jews.
about
They're
that. I
saying that,
mean, maybe the Jews went to Rome at the time that Hyrcanus was brought to, or Aristobulus was brought to Rome in
well, I mean,
chains
Caesar was,
by
we took
Caesar.
the
That's
size
right.
of Caesar's, and that was already like 40 BC that we took the size of Caesar.
Right. That's right. So that might have been the beginning of the Jewish
And even
diaspora throughout the Roman Empire, and there was evidence that there were Jews.
Herod was trained in the Roman Academy
What? Yeah, and I think
in Rome, and it's
he
saying that
was a
there
Roman
was a
puppet.
significant amount of Jews
Right.
in the Royal Roman Academy, and from my understanding, at in the era of Jesus Christ, that 5% of Rome was Jews.
That's
That
interesting.
five
I know
percent
that
of
there were Jews in the Rhine Valley that were settled there as part of a kind of a population movement agenda on the part of the Romans. The Romans tended to shift people around the empire, and so you had Jewish settlements in the Rhine Valley. I think certainly in Roman times. I don't know how far back it goes, but it's an interesting history. As far as Christmas goes, my comment is Merry Christmas to all of our, not only our Christian listeners, but let's remember that Christmas is an American holiday. It was declared by executive order by President Ulysses S. Grant in 1870 to be an American holiday. And I honor that as a Jew, not for religious reasons, of course, but I honor it because not only do I honor America's Christian traditions, but I honor the ministry of Jesus. I don't mind celebrating his birthday because if it hadn't been for Jesus, we may not have an America today. He brought the Torah, his ministry, brought the ethics and morals of Sinai to the world in basically what is a form of Judaism. You might even say it's Reform Judaism. And by doing so, he accomplished something that the Jewish people otherwise could not or did not accomplish. And that was to bring the morals and ethics of the Torah and the rules and regulations of the universe to a large segment of mankind. I believe that the ultimate flowering of that movement was the creation of the United States. So, for that reason, I am very happy to honor Jesus on what has been deemed his birthday as an American, not as a, not because I believe that Jesus, the Christology piece, that's a Christian matter. But as a Jew, I honor his ministry because I believe it was a Jewish ministry. He was a Jew. Even if he was an apostate Jew, he was a Jew. And he brought Jewish ethics and morals to the world. What say you, David?
Yeah, I like to call the Jesus principle the concept of suffering on behalf of other people to help out the world. It's okay, like my problems, things are relatively pretty good for me. I mean, I wish I had a wife and family or the things to worry about, but like relatively, I'm not complaining. And there's a lot of suffering out there, and the concept that you take suffering upon of other people upon yourself is the essential crucifix uh, Jesus principle, which is a Judaic
It
principle,
is.
but
It
it's
is.
not generally the major emphasized Judaic principle. So I think there's karmatically from the Jewish
I
God
think it
to
is.
raise up
We're taught to do
Christianity.
good.
But I'm saying that God, in what you're saying, that God could have chosen different methods to spread this methods, and he chose Jesus and the Jesus principle to spread this message. And it's probably because this Jewish principle of suffering on behalf of humanity is not emphasized as much as it should. And that's why Christmas has that general holiday spirit of caring for the poor, being nice to one another,
Right.
and the acceptance of suffering. I was talking about social distancing, and it's somewhat, I mean, it's actually a physical perception of space like martial arts, but on a heart level, it's about caring about others in my space, that even the space that I'm standing, I'm willing to cede the space that I have for other people to protect their health. And even that is somewhat of this compassionate Jesus principle, which in theory is the essential representation of the Judeo God of mercy, compassion, caring about the poor, caring about the widow, and in the weak. Although obviously the conception of reward and punishment in the material world comes out in a much harsher way. So generally, um, I don't really accept Christianity as a religion, but I do support and believe, and so say the Jesus principle. And I think, unfortunately,
I agree.
this Jesus principle is clearly Judaic in origin. However, it's one of the more negated factors in Jewish
It is.
Israeli practice of the this concept of even revenge versus turning the other cheek, or these various things that
Well, we have a
there's a
little
lot of
difference on
Jewish
that.
principle in it, but the concept of this of just take the insult, just suffer, like suffer for the benefit of humanity. That there is a Jewish instinct, um, like in the ancient times, that Jews don't believe Jesus is the Messiah because we expected Messiah to conquer the Romans and overturn our enemies and to restore us to our former glorious status. We didn't
Hmm.
expect Jesus to suffer for other people, even though there's clearly verses and parts of that within the Judaic tradition.
Right.
And maybe the Lubavitch Rebbe um, had a pretty good equal. Even the Lubavitch, I told Adam Green even that the Lubavitch Rebbe is probably the best modern day example you could think of Jesus. in that sense because of the
I
Messianic
think a lot of
order.
Jews are,
It wasn't
and it
about
is
like
part of
arming and
Judaism.
peace deals. It was about alleviating
Yeah,
suffering. And the Lubavitch
absolutely.
Rebbe saying, I will take other people's suffering upon myself to help reduce their suffering.
And I think the Jewish people have had a long history of that, as do Christians. And I might say that we shouldn't be so maybe Eurocentric or Judeo Christian centric in that you might find these same traditions in different Eastern philosophies and animist philosophies as well. And
You will. You'll find more thriving examples of Christianity outside the West than the
I'm
West
not.
there are.
I'm talking about non-Christian Eastern societies. I'm talking about. I think Islam has an element of this. I mean, sub-Saharan African societies have this. It's not unique to Christians and Jews. That's all I'm saying. But yes, it was a major portion of the ministry of Jesus, and it did derive from the prophets and from Jewish tradition, and I honor that. I want to just say one more thing though about why I honor Jesus, and this is something that I think Jesus inspires all of us in this action, and that is that when Jesus stood up alone in front of Pontius Pilate, who was representing the Roman Empire, the most powerful secular force on the planet, the largest physical empire that man had ever known up until that point. And when Pontius Pilate said to him, "Who do you answer to?" And Jesus responded by saying, "I answer to a higher authority," kind of like Hebrew national, right? "I answer to a higher authority." He was rejecting the secular power of the state to control him. He was saying that I stand before God, not before the state. I'm answerable to heaven. I'm answerable to a greater power than anything that could be wielded on earth. And he was, of course, crucified within an hour after making that statement. And it was a very subversive statement as viewed by the Romans, and it was to what Romans saw as their authority over the world. But it has inspired people of all faiths ever since, because we as individuals can stand up to the secular state because we do answer to a higher authority ultimately. We answer to the great sovereign God because as citizens, as people, we have a limited sovereignty and we derive that sovereignty from God and not from the state. So, anyway, on that note, Doovid, I want to thank you for joining me as always.
Yeah, but if you just let me
Yeah,
one
please.
final point of that. I mean, it says in Moses, but like the Jesus, is the most famous purveyor of the message to the world, this servant on the mount. And yeah, I talked about it with mostly Jehovah's Witness because they come to my door and talk to me. Um, but this essential counterintuitive concept of charity and being kind, that from an evolutionary material perspective, altruism, being kind to people is difficult to explain. And from a practical, logical perspective, unfortunately, it's logical to be mean to people. And it takes a special,
It does.
subtle understanding of God or even faith to say, even though the material realm tells me that I'm better off being selfish and not caring about others, that there's a pervading principle that if you take suffering upon yourself in order to make the world a better place, that there's an external godly factor, if you want to call it the Jesus principle, if you're a believing Jew, and it comes from the God of Moses, even though Moses says very harsh things. But yes, me and Charles both believe there is a God, and I'm going to be a nice guy, even if everything, I'm going to try to, even if everything tells me that it's better off to be mean, um, because I'm a believer, and that's the important holiday message.
Yeah,
Generally be good, be kind to each other, and even if it appears that being good and kind to each other just opens us up to more suffering, that there is some sort of spiritual force in the world that balances it in the favor of kindness.
absolutely. Very well said, David. And thanks so much for joining me as always.
Happy holidays. Looking forward to your 2
Same
o'clock
here.
interview.
Talk to you next week.